Hello, everyone, and welcome to Right Here, Right Queer, a podcast where we talk about queer books and stuff. My name is Carolina Cruz. I am one of your hosts on this podcast, and with me today I have Valerie Gomez.
Hi, I'm Valerie Gomez. I am an author.
Valerie has a couple stories out and then one coming out, is that right?
The third one just came out. Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about each of those stories and kind of what their deal is?
Yes. So Cover Story is my first novel. It's a full-length novel. It is a queer contemporary romance set in New York City. And it features an up-and-coming actor who's outgoing, gregarious actor slash comedian and an introverted art director of like a GQ style men's fashion magazine. One is Mexican American. His name is Dex. And he suffers from anxiety and panic attacks. And so a lot of the book deals with how he is dealing with his celebrity status. He's not a household name yet, but he is gaining fame and recognition, and how he's dealing with his anxiety about that. And the other character is an art director of a magazine. He's more introverted. Both of them are based a lot on my own personal experiences. The next book that I have is called Coming Home. It's a novella that's kind of more like an extended epilogue of Cover Story. So it's more of the happily ever after. Cover Story does have a happily ever after. Let me just say that.
Okay, good. I'm not quite done with it. I've got maybe like 30 more pages
Yeah.
left, and you got me worried for a second.
No, it's more of a happy for now, and then the epilogue is more a little bit further down the line. And there are some things that happen. There's no breakup, so I'll just go ahead and say that. But it's just more about like life with the two of them together. And then the third one just came out. It is called A Handyman for the Holidays, and it is part of the Home for the Holidays collection of queer romance novellas. The main character in that one is named Frank. He is also Mexican American, and he is a handyman and woodworker in a small town in Michigan. And he has verbal apraxia, which is a disability where he can hear, he can process language, he can't speak. It's like something in the brain that there's a disconnect between the brain and the muscles that are able to create language. So he doesn't speak. He's very introverted. He's kind of just put up all these walls around him to protect himself. And he's just sort of alone. And, a nice young man moves into town with his deaf daughter, and they form a friendship and, eventually more. So, yeah.
I love where that's going already. I'm definitely going to have to pick that one up.
And it's short. It's very sweet. It's a lot of fall vibes, like crunching leaves and acorns and things like that. The fall.
All that good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds perfect. It's been miserable weather up where I live recently, and all I want is like a nice, cozy fall vibes book to read.
I've seen in a few reviews I have gotten that it's like a cozy blanket or, a nice cup of hot cocoa, that it's been like compared to those things. So I'll take that.
That sounds lovely. It's kind of what we're talking about here mostly, but I really it is what we're going to talk about here. So I'm just going to move into it, because if I get off on a tangent now, we're never going to get to what we need to talk about.
Yeah, let's do it.
When I first kind of heard of Cover Story and stuff, I think that I had seen you pop up on some of my friends' Instagram stories, some of the other Right Here, Right Queer folks. And I remember seeing a post that you had made about kind of mental health in the Latina community as a whole, and especially when it comes, I think you said especially when it comes to men. I don't remember if that is a distinction that you made in that post.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
But that definitely personally stood out to me because of kind of my family history with mental health. My dad is Puerto Rican, and I am mentally ill, and that kind of relationship has been affected a lot by that. So when I read that post, I was like, man, that really resonated with me. And I think even if I hadn't seen that post and I had started reading Cover Story, I think I would have hooked onto that with Dax pretty quickly. But you mentioned when you were talking about this that this kind of story was kind of based on personal experiences. Do you want to elaborate on that? What kind of gave you the drive to write this story?
Yeah. So Dax's struggles with his mental health, specifically anxiety and panic attacks, are taken directly from my own experiences. I have been dealing with anxiety and panic attacks for a long time. specifically the panic attacks that I describe in the book are very much taken from my own experiences, like how I experience panic attacks. I mean, I know they're very different for everyone, but that is specifically how I experience them. So I put a lot of myself out in this book, especially talking about mental health. I mean, I've had anxiety for a long time, and I have seen it in my family. I have family members who also have issues with anxiety, and it struck me that within my family, and also I've seen in the greater Latina community, when it comes to men and anxiety and mental health, it's something that it's seen as a weakness or something you just don't talk about. And I think that is, I would love for that to change at some point, because it's not a weakness. It's a different way of how your brain works. I think that there's this, I don't know, thought process where men who need help, men who reach out and speak up and say, I need help, are seen as weak or are seen as not able to provide. Men are supposed to be providers, right? And you're supposed to be stoic and quiet and not complain. And anything that requires men to ask for help is seen as something that is the flaw. And so a lot of times it gets ignored. I've seen it in my own family, where men in my family just ignore it, and it becomes this thing that is just, oh, well, that's just part of their personality. They can be difficult sometimes, or they can get into these moods, but it's not really seen as something that can be helped.
Yeah, it's a kind of circular mentality of like, I'm supposed to be the supporter. I'm supposed to help other people and be the strong person in this family for everyone else. I'm not supposed to need help.
Absolutely.
And in kind of trying to ignore that, it becomes this bigger problem on its own, and they're causing the hurt that they hoped they wouldn't cause by needing to ask for help. They don't realize that asking for help is a way to help the other people, that it's a whole like symbiotic relationship.
That's exactly right. The mental health struggles becomes the problem, or part of the problem. It contributes to the problems. I've seen these memes on social media where it's like things that Mexicans believe in, like chupacabra, La Llorona, and Vicks Vapor Rub, but things that Mexicans don't believe in: depression,
Yeah.
mental health issues, therapy.
hmm
And, I've seen those kind of memes a lot. It's funny and they're out there, but I mean, there's a reason behind it. I mean, it's true.
Right. And it's frustrating to see it become almost, because of the memes, it becomes almost a point of pride
hmm
when it's turned into a joke like that. And it's like, no, you see, you're doing it again by turning it into a joke.
hmm
We should be acknowledging that this is a serious problem that's actually affecting the overall community. It's that like machismo,
Yes.
where it's like this intersection of masculinity and mental health that like it's not unique to the Latina community by any means, but it's certainly very noticeable, and that's why the memes have developed. And I do agree. I wish it was taken just, it's haha funny because it's true, but it's also laughing through the pain.
Yes, absolutely. The word machismo, I mean, that's exactly right. And I don't think that it is specific to the Latino community. That's just the community that I happen to be a part of. But
hmm
I think it's like that with a lot of immigrant communities. I would love for it to be something that we can talk about more and be more open about. I do think it's getting better. It's starting to.
That's why I appreciate like Encanto was really nice for that reason, because even though it focuses on the matriarch of the family, I cried a lot because I was thinking of my dad. I'm like, this is the way that he behaved and the way that he was so tough on me kind of reminded me of what Mirabelle went with through her grandmother, where it's like, yes, I worked really hard, and a lot of immigrant families are like this. I worked really hard to create a life where you could excel and not have to struggle. But in doing that, I've conflated struggle with morality, right? So
hmm
struggling is righteous. And now that you don't have to struggle and it seems like you aren't making the most of life, now I'm looking down on you. And it's this like, well, but didn't you struggle specifically so I wouldn't have to?
Yeah.
So I appreciate that these conversations are being had on a much bigger level with stuff like Encanto and like with Turning Red, to go to a different community with that, where it's like we're starting to have these conversations on a much broader, more marketable, I guess, scale. to me, that has to mean that we're getting a little better, I hope.
I think so. I mean, I think it's not something that's going to change in one generation or two generations. I think it's going to take a lot of time. And especially in current political climates where, again, it's like these ideas of masculinity are being pushed to the forefront by,
Hmm.
many individuals. And I think it's harmful in a lot of ways. But I think that there are enough people now that are seeing that that is not the way most people live. And I don't think people want to live that way. So,
Yeah, that's why it's so important for the people who are recognizing that, like you, to make art like Cover Story that talks about it so frankly, so that, we can kind of make people feel heard. Someone reads this book and is like, oh, like, here's a character who is willing to go through this struggle, who gets to the point where he's like recognizing this about himself. It could help a lot of people recognize that in themselves. So,
and that's my hope. I mean, when I started writing this, I didn't start out writing it to be something that I wanted, like this big, broad, I want to help the world by recognizing. It was just a story that was important to me. And I think as I was going, it became something bigger and more important to me. But at the time, when I started writing, this was before I was on social media. And so it was just a story for myself. And as it went on, my experiences started to come out and my feelings about mental health became much more part of the story than just the love story. Because it is a love story. So I mean, I think kind of like,
that's like a part of it because the way that AJ responds to Dax and to his panic attacks, like there's a scene where AJ not expecting to find Dax mid panic attack and the way that he handles it, like even that's something where it's like you deserve that out of a partner. Everyone deserves that out of a partner. And it's nice to see a love story where that's a part of it and where the way that AJ treats Dax in that moment is part of what makes you root for them, you know?
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, part of it, my personal experience that I was writing into this was also, it wasn't just the panic attacks. It was a lot about the anxiety of waiting for the next panic attack to happen, because
Hmm.
that's also a very real part of having panic attacks is you don't know when they're going to happen. So part of the anxiety is that you never know when it's going to come up and when it's going to just happen. And someone who is a celebrity who has to be in front of people, in front of cameras, dealing with that and trying to like manage the anxiety of, when is the next one going to happen, which could potentially trigger a panic attack. That's so stressful in itself. So,
Yeah, and it melds in really nicely with what we were talking about with I think this like applies to like older Latino men and there's like their like need to be like to push through things. With Dax, he's in this position where he has to push through these things because he has to if they happen at an inopportune moment, he initially feels this responsibility to push through them because it's interfering with his career and his responsibilities. And I think that that fleshes it out really nicely as to kind of explaining his mentality towards panic attacks and towards what they mean for him and how he thinks he should feel about them.
right. And he does at one point have a panic attack that there are consequences to having these panic attacks and not listening when someone suggests that maybe he should talk to someone about it. Yeah, I mean, it's not just like, oh, I had this panic attack and I'm okay now, but like there are like very real things that happen as a result.
Yeah, I like that because that's something that like I kind of relate to it in a sense of like chronic pain, which is something that I have my own issues with. Where it's like people don't think about the fact that again, the anxiety of not knowing when you're going to have a flare up or a panic attack consumes the part of your life that you should be living,
Yeah.
not in fear because this is the good part. This is the part where you're not having a flare up or a panic attack. And it's like, no, it's still affecting me right this moment.
Yep. Absolutely.
I really like how that was written. I also, I like Dax in general. He's a good character.
Thanks.
Oh, wow, we actually went through a lot of stuff that I was going to ask you about otherwise. So this is perfect. We're going at a very nice pace. So, what are some things that maybe Cover Story, because Cover Story focuses so specifically on like panic attacks and anxiety. Is there anything that you weren't able to address with like the setting and the setup and Dax specifically as a character that you would maybe like to address in future stories?
Yeah, so one thing I would like to explore more with other characters in the future is what it means to be Latino. because I think there needs to be more representation out there in books about being Latino, but there are so many different experiences. I mean, some, like myself, I grew up in a small town, mostly white. We were raised to be the same as our friends. So we were raised in a very, without a lot of culture, we weren't raised to be different and celebrate our culture very openly. My parents wanted us to be the same as our friends. They didn't want us to be treated any differently because they grew up treated differently because they were Mexican. And so they didn't want us to feel that way. So assimilation at the time that I was growing up, assimilation was very important to them. And so we didn't grow up speaking Spanish. We didn't grow up with a lot of these traditions that some of the younger generations celebrate now. For a long time, I felt like that meant that I was less Latino. Like I didn't quite count as like, I was like a white Latino, and feeling like not quite enough, not Latino enough. And I don't feel that way anymore, but I do think that there are a lot of books where the Latino characters are very much celebrating their culture, celebrating their language. And I don't see a lot of people like myself who I would love to celebrate more. And I would love to see more people like me who don't speak Spanish, but I'm still Latino. That doesn't make me any less Latino. And so something like that is what I would like to explore more in future books.
Totally. And I'm right there with you in a lot of ways. My current boss, her husband is Puerto Rican, and we were talking about some comments that were made about Puerto Ricans in public media recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been asked by local news to speak on it as a Puerto Rican, and I'm like, well, no, I don't think I'll do that because even though with everything you said, it's very true. Even if you don't speak Spanish, even if your parents, because my dad very similarly was very like wanted us to be culturally more similar to our white peers than to like the way that he grew up because of that fear of discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
But on top of that, I was raised in a space where Puerto Rico has a lot of very strong diaspora in the like greater United States. In Florida, in New York, in Pennsylvania, which is where the conversation was happening. But I grew up on the West Coast, and the diaspora that I was more involved in was more Mexican. So a lot of my like culture that I was around growing up was not Puerto Rican in the way that having a genuine Puerto Rican diaspora and community around me would have been.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to ask me like as a Puerto Rican in Pennsylvania, like what is your opinion on what so and so said? I don't feel comfortable necessarily speaking as a Puerto Rican in this diaspora because I'm not necessarily that connected. Truly, it does feel a little bit alienating. And again, it doesn't make me any less Puerto Rican or Latino. It just makes me a different kind of.
Yeah.
And that's, like you said, like finding more stories where the nuances of how, because America as a country is so complex in its history, there are so many people with so many different backgrounds who nominally belong to the same community and have these shared cultures, but have such different experiences and backgrounds. So all that to say, I hope you do get the chance to write that because I would love to read more stories where characters experience that and work through that because I personally would find that very relatable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time in the books that I've written so far. I haven't spent a lot of time on, they speak English for the most part, and I don't put a lot of Spanish into it. I try to include cultural references, but it's the kind of thing that I experienced myself, like my closeness with my family and just my own experiences, and not trying to put other people's experiences or what I think someone else's experience. Like if I were to try and write a Latino character who was first generation, very, very much part of a like first generation family, I wouldn't know how to do that. I wouldn't do it justice, I think, because that's not my own experience. So
I'm right there with you. I think if I tried to write that, I'd probably need like a sensitivity reader. And whether or not that sensitivity reader could come from my own family is another thing.
right.
But it's still a different experience where I'd want to, yeah, 100% would want to just double check that I'm doing it justice.
hmm Right.
But I really enjoyed the way that, like, again, because it's very similar to my own experience. I really enjoyed the way that Dax was written. I could definitely see hints of my own family through the way that he interacts, like the way that his sister just is,
Yeah.
and the way that he interacts with his mom.
Yeah. The sister was not from my own experience, but I just really liked her. But the way that our family is very close, like the relationship part is very much based on my own experience. So,
That's the kind of thing where it's like it's so natural to me to read a family with that kind of closeness that sometimes like watching Disney Channel growing up and seeing the way that families were represented in those families and seeing my friends who were like very white having those kind of family dynamics, that felt weird to me. And then when I would see like close Hispanic families in media, I'm like, ah, this is what a real family is like, for lack of a
yeah.
better term. I was like 12. I was like, yeah, the other ones they're making that up. That's not how families really act.
Well, and that's why I wanted to include in cover story. I mean, AJ's family experience is much different because he doesn't have a close relationship with his family, with his mom. And Dax's family, they're very close. Like I mean, he's in his 30s and he lives at home, which is another thing that I think in Latino culture, like to live at home isn't a sign of like failure. That's just what, I mean, people do it all the time. And it's just, he says, I wanted to save money and why not? Because I love my family and they're great. So, and it's not seen as like something shameful. And I didn't want to write it as like, oh, he's embarrassed to be living with his family. He's not ashamed of it at all.
No, yeah. Yeah. No, I think I have a lot of family that's in similar situations where it's like, well, that's your support system.
Hmm.
It's actually kind of weird that other people expect their kids to just suddenly want to leave when they hit a certain age. I
Yeah,
I appreciate this like
absolutely.
and then this is talking as someone who did move away from my family, but my relationship with my in-laws is like I see my in-laws once a week at least,
Mhm.
you know?
Wow.
And that
Yeah.
feels just right. I can't imagine living without a family support system the way that some of my friends do. No offense to them. They're doing great. This is just how I want to live.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. My extended family, my aunts and uncles and cousins, they all still, for the most part, they live in the same place that they've grown up and for generations have lived. I mean, because they choose to, they want to live there and be close to family. And I think I love that.
Community is really important,
Hmm.
especially like things like economically are very tough. Knowing that you have a community to go to. I've referenced this a lot. This is something that has always stood out to me is that in Puerto Rico, you have those hurricanes that are happening all the time. And when I would go and visit my family, we went and visited my family in 2017, which was right after Hurricane Maria hit. And a lot of my family still didn't have power. But there's this incredible sense of community within that family where it's like we're all meeting at different people's houses throughout the week leading up to Christmas. Everyone's bringing like a dish, whatever dish they were able to make in their home, whether or not they had power. People were bringing generators and fuel, whatever needed to be done to make sure that we could all be together. People were doing it. I don't know, it's just really special. It's like
Oh.
all we have is each other. And I think
Hmm.
that my dad's side of the family has really driven that home to me and makes me want to make sure that I have that where I am now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And some people don't have that and or their family is not accepting or whatever and they make their own family, but I think at the end of the day everyone wants that sense of community and that sense of family, whether that's your own that you were born into or that you've created for yourself. And that's where AJ in the book, AJ doesn't have that for himself. And so it's sort of a found family also because he appreciates that in Dax's family.
Ah, it's so sweet. I loved his initial interaction with Camila is so funny. I was grinning the whole time. But it's so sweet to see them so happy to meet him and include him basically right off the bat.
Yeah. And the mom is basically my mom. Like she is so inviting and like she's just so welcoming to it doesn't matter who, and she's always been that way. My sister would bring home her weird high school friends and it didn't matter. I would bring home my like my friends and it didn't matter like who they were, where they came from. Just come in, have a meal,
Oh,
everybody's welcome.
that's so great. Last question here to kind of wrap things up. Have you gotten any particular reader responses to Dax and Dax's journey that have stood out to you at all, or to the story in general?
Yeah, so one thing that has stood out to me in reviews is people's commenting that it feels very real, which to me is such a huge compliment, and for different reasons. Some of the things that were mentioned in reviews were Dax's relationship with his family, which we talked about how he's close with his family and the family dynamics with his sister and with his mom, that felt very real and relatable. His struggles with his anxiety also, and just his wanting to hide his panic attacks and wanting to not address his anxiety and just try to ignore it for as long as possible, and how he was trying to deal with that. I did get some comments about his reaction to AJ's suggestion that he see a therapist. And if you haven't read the book, it is a point at which they disagree very strongly. Because, again, I think it goes back to this idea of men seeming weak when they feel like they need to ask for help. And he didn't react in the nicest way when AJ suggested that he see a therapist. And a lot of people didn't like it, didn't like the way that he reacted. But I felt that it was very necessary. Like, if someone had suggested, like, hey, you should see a therapist, and they say, okay, that's a great idea. I think I'll give him a call tomorrow. Like, to me, that does not feel real and feel genuine.
No.
Like, his reaction was very strong and very negative toward this suggestion that there was something wrong with him.
Which is exactly how I've seen people react before.
Hmm.
Like, especially like Latino people that I know or Latina people that I know is like, yeah, there it is this, like you said, the suggestion that something's wrong with you. It's like the
Hmm.
SNL skit with Pedro Pascal where he is playing the Latina mother whose son is like, I have depression, and she's immediately like, my son does not have depression.
Right.
It's like, yeah, that's exactly, again, the reason that it's a meme is because it's so prevalent. So
Hmm.
that felt, again, like you said, very real when Dax had that reaction.
Right.
Even if it's negative, it's like sometimes characters are wrong.
Yeah, yeah. And it was, it was necessary for the story because otherwise it
Mhm.
would have just been like, okay, well, that's that problem checked off the list.
Yeah, dare I say a little boring.
Right, right. And the thing with mental health is, even in romance, like love does not cure mental health issues as much as we would like it to,
Yeah, if only it were that easy.
right? Like just fall in love and it'll be fine.
I wish.
It does not cure trauma. It does not cure anything. You have to work through it.
It can't fix your brain chemistry,
No,
unfortunately.
no. And it makes me so frustrated when I see that in books that someone is dealing with especially something very severe like PTSD or things like that. And it's just like, oh, well, they fell in love, so it's fine. So the reactions to his character feeling very real, whether people liked that or not, it was still like, to me, it felt like a compliment because it was not just some sort of happy ending, like, oh, okay, you're right, great, let's do it, and everything is fine.
Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of people really related to Dax's character in different ways, which I thought was really, really great. And I also like on the other side, the AJ character. I've had people comment about his sexuality, and they were like, "Oh, that's a lot like me." So I thought that was kind of cool too.
Yeah, I related to AJ with that as well, where it's like the way that he talks about it definitely felt relatable. I love him.
And to reference, he is bisexual and he has very limited experience with men, but he knows he's bisexual. He has some experience, but for him to say like it wasn't like a 50-50, I like men and women equally. He is more attracted to women, but occasionally men. And he just kind of was trying to figure out a label for himself and then finally decided like I don't need a label. I guess I'm bisexual, but I don't know. It's also nobody's goddamn business.
Yeah,
And that's, that was also kind of me working out my own stuff too. So,
mood.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of me working things out with this first book, which I think is pretty normal for
Oh, yeah.
a lot of people's first books. They're working out their own like neuroses.
I think you're always working out something in your books, even if you don't know what it is.
Hmm.
Sometimes I look back at things that I never published, but that I wrote forever ago, and I'm like, oh man, I didn't know it, but I was going through it at the time. So I'm interested. I'm always interested to see. Sometimes it's very minor. Sometimes it's like, oh, I had a crush on this person and I definitely wrote a self-insert in this story. But sometimes it's major stuff like, oh, like I went back and read some old stuff. I'm like, man, I've always had gender issues. I just didn't know that's what I was writing with this character.
That's one thing that since I've started writing, I like that part of it where you can kind of explore these things without saying them out loud or without, you can try stuff out and it's like, well, that didn't work for that character. So,
Right.
I mean, maybe that's me, maybe it's not, but
See if it sounds right.
yeah, exactly.
And it's great that people are seeing that as well. Even if you don't relate to a character in a few years, seeing that other people do, it's a validating experience to be like, yeah, that was real, what I was feeling, if other people are feeling it too.
Yeah.
Very, very cool stuff. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation. I feel like it's a lot of stuff that has been on my mind both recently and just for a long time. So I appreciate you joining me to talk about all these different things. And would you mind telling everyone where they can find you and what you have coming up and going on in the next little while here?
Sure, yeah. So the book that I'm currently working on, it's very early to talk about, but it is a romance with a little bit of fantasy injected into it. It does feature two main characters, but I haven't worked out how to kind of describe it succinctly. So you have to just wait and see because it is very different from what I've written so far. So yeah, but you'll be hearing about it soon. And you can follow me on Instagram. That's pretty much the only social media that I use. So, and my Instagram is at Valerie Gomez underscore writes. So, yeah, you can see what I'm up to over there.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
Truly, Instagram is the only social media that exists at all right now.
pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is Valerie Gomez underscore writes. And you can find the podcast itself at right here. That's RIGHTHERE, Right Queer, WRITE, queer podcast on Instagram, where we will post all of our upcoming episodes. I know we either have just spoken to or are going to speak to Kara Jorgensen soon, and I'm very excited about that one. So make sure that you follow the Instagram for that. And other than that, thank you for listening, everyone. And thank you again to Valerie for guesting, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much.